The Raijintek Ophion is quite a bit smaller in comparison to the C700M that we just worked with a moment ago. So this is the opposite end of the scale as Cooler Master's $440 C700M. This is Raijintek's Mini-ITX case, the Ophion, that we saw at Computex earlier this year actually, in a bit of a different state. They've improved it in some ways and they've not improved it in others. Before that, this video is brought to you by the NZXT E-Series power supplies. The E-Series PSUs are high-end power supplies with real-time digital voltage and temperature monitoring, per-rail wattage measurements, and data logging functionality for power usage. The E-Series PSUs also come with a 10-year warranty all the way down to the 500-watt unit, and they run fully modular and with silent fan operating modes. Learn more at the link below. So just looking at the case, yes, it's a bit of a hot box. That is kind of what Mini-ITX cases do though. But some of them do it less bad than others. SilverStone's SG13, for instance, is one of the best cases we've worked with. We can highly recommend it for ITX builds, and it's small and it still cools really well. So it's absolutely possible to make an ITX case that is still very good at cooling. This case takes more of a traditional mid-tower approach to closing off the front panel and adding glass to the sides, and then they do have a bit of a gap here that was not present at Computex when we first saw it. So originally, this panel was flush against the side, and to Raijintek's credit, they have added in a plastic standoff in there to give some spacing for breathability. And this will ultimately just follow whatever pressure system you create because it comes with no fans. So you can install fans in the top and kind of in the bottom, though clearance is a bit of an issue. In most cases, we wouldn't have been able to fit one with our build, but with a low profile 120 fan, you can squeeze that into the bottom just barely. Just keep the cables out of it. The case though, so even though they've added standoff so it's not flush against the case, there's also an optional foam included, and we did leave that in the box for all of the testing. But if you wanted to incinerate the parts in favor of noise, you could do that. The tools are given to you for that purpose. So this small box is interesting because what happens is the way they've built it, you end up routing a PCI-e riser cable around the entire case. And either you squeeze it behind the motherboard or you route it over a downdraft cooler. So it would be sitting over the fan in that instance and obstructing everything. So those are the two ways to route the cable. The video card sits a bit at an angle. As a result, we have footage of it. We'll talk about more how it's installed later. There's a built-in standoff in there as well and extender for PCI-e. So very interesting orientation, which has interesting thermal implications as well. For fans, we ended up testing with one fan for all of the baseline tests. Normally, our baseline test, we generally do however it ships, and that's it. But for this case, we couldn't even make it through tests without it crashing, just how it ships. So you should absolutely be budgeting for a fan no matter what in this case, and we'll show you why as we get through the thermal numbers and through Patrick's build notes, and that's where we'll go to next. New since Computex is a kit of adhesive foam filter strips to be packed around the edges of the new panels, which entirely defeats the purpose of leaving a gap. The strips are only useful in a negative pressure system anyway, and in a negative pressure system, every gap would need to be covered in order for dust to be filtered effectively. At that point, it would just be easier to remove the standoffs and install the glass panels flush, which is possible. The filter strips are optional, so we left them in the box where they belong. The GPU riser cable is the case's biggest weak point. The card must be oriented pins down, while the motherboard must be oriented slot up. There's no good diagram showing how to actually install the cable, so we'll do our best to show it on screen and describe it. The cable connects to the GPU, goes down through the slot underneath the motherboard, bends 180 degrees, and travels upwards through the gap between the motherboard and the motherboard tray, and finally curls 270 degrees over the top of the motherboard and into the PCIe slot. There isn't much slack, and it has to make some unpleasantly sharp turns. In addition, since our CryoRig C7 cooler has a chunky bracket already using most of the gap behind the motherboard, there was barely any space for the cable. Even with a normal backplate, the arrangement means that the PCIe cable is tightly sandwiched between the hottest part of the GPU backplate and the hottest part of the CPU bracket. Since the front of the case is completely devoid of fans, the empty real estate inside the front panel is used for a 2.5-inch drive mount. It isn't the easiest drive mount to access, but it is tucked neatly out of the way and it doesn't cover any vent holes, which the other two do. Space for either one 3.5 or one 2.5 inch drive or three 2.5 inch drives is adequate for most users, and there are only two USB ports, but one is Type-C. The Ophion looks focused, which is why it has two tempered glass panels with the GPU on one side and the motherboard on the other. Getting into the thermal section, as always, check the link in the description below for the article where we have the testing methodology laid out if you want to read through this section or read how we did the testing. We're planning to stick to the stock fan configuration for our baseline testing, which is no fans at all. That isn't how the case should be used, and we found it resulted in instant thermal throttling and even thermal shutdowns under our normal non-torture workloads like Blender. The cooling section on the Ophion product page suggests filling fan slots with one bottom intake fan, which is tough to fit in there, and two top exhaust. But we try to test cases the way they ship. Given the reassuringly large air gaps along the side panels, it's easy to imagine someone deciding that finding space for a case fan is more trouble than it's worth. However, our test bench was unable to complete the torture or the Blender CPU test without additional cooling. So we added a single NZXT RF AP120 fan as top exhaust with the top filter removed for our new baseline. That model is $13 minimum direct from NZXT's site, so we are now considering the case cost to be an additional $13 higher or more depending on the fan you buy. We also tried top intake using the same fan with a filter installed, and we didn't use the included adhesive foam strips in any tests. CPU torture testing is first. The average peak CPU temperature in torture testing was 72.3 degrees Celsius over ambient, but that's lowballing it since the test crashed before full completion. In reality, the score is more of a DNF, did not finish the test. The CPU was at 97 degrees Celsius when going strictly by the readout and ignoring ambient, and that was at the time of the crash when it was still climbing. A filtered top intake fan reduced the average peak DT to a much more manageable and uncrashy 67.2 degrees Celsius delta T, but that's still one of the warmer results on the chart, and with an extra fan. The Ophion ends up around the Taku and stock level 20 VT, ultimately. The unfiltered top exhaust fan brought temperatures down another huge step to 58.9 degrees Celsius DT, which is actually a good result and comparable to the Inwin A1 with three case fans. The top fan slots are directly above the nightmare heat sandwich of the GPU and CPU coolers, so an intake fan has to first fight the filter and then push air around both sides of the case. In other words, the top intake fan is pushing air from a small vent towards a small hotspot, while the top exhaust fan is pulling air from many different gaps and vents towards the same hotspot. The top exhaust test has also certainly benefited from removing the top filter. Moving on to GPU torture testing, the GPU's average peak temperature during the incomplete no-fan torture test was 59.1 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient. The non-delta temperature, if you prefer, is 84 degrees, which is where NVIDIA Pascal cards throttle hard and start dropping clocks to try and maintain that temperature, so thermals were drifting out of control from here as well. The cryo-rig Taku approached this temperature, but we also managed to actually complete the benchmark in the Taku. Top intake reduced temperature several degrees to a respectable 51.4 degrees, and top exhaust did pretty much the same at 51.7 around the 280X with no top filter. The 3D Mark stress test results are especially interesting here in contrast to the torture test. With both the GPU and CPU under load, they heated each other up to a point of crashing the system. With just the GPU stress, it successfully limited itself to 82 degrees Celsius non-delta temperature, so it's still throttle territory, and our average peak was a 60 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient. That's almost the same as the cryo-rig Taku, which also thermal throttled by the way, but the Ophion maintained a considerably lower average clock of 1709 MHz to the Taku's 1761 MHz. This impacts frame rate, not a ton, but enough. We can show that in this clock comparison chart versus time, that with a top exhaust fan, the average peak delta T cooled to the level of the 280X at 53.3 degrees Celsius resulted in a healthier clock average of 1776 MHz. We rarely see clock speed deviate from about 1775 MHz, so anything significantly above or below that indicates exceptionally bad or good cooling. Moving on to Blender, we did run the Blender CPU benchmark without any fans, but it crashed the system again, and incomplete benchmarks are of limited use. The Ophion is impressive in its propensity to crash. We typically can pass a Blender run even with exceptionally bad cooling, but no such luck here. The case is a Hotbox. With a single exhaust fan, average peak CPU temperature was 44.5 degrees delta T over ambient, just slightly warmer than the stock H200i. If it wasn't clear before now, the Ophion requires purchasing at least one case fan. Passive cooling doesn't cut it here. It does okay once adding more fans, but we wanted to highlight the importance of buying at least one, and something at least half decent at that. Don't go too cheap on the fan. The Blender GPU test with no fans raised GPU temperature to an average peak of 42.2 degrees Celsius over ambient, above any of the other cases in the chart thermally, although the Taku does come close. With an exhaust fan, this was lowered to 32.6 degrees, a significant drop of about 10 degrees Celsius, and it's one of our cooler results and on par with the SG13, a case that we heavily recommended. So buy a fan is the result here. Ultimately, for the price on this case, you need to add about maybe 13 bucks for a decent fan, something like that. So it's not really a $100 case or 90 or whatever they end up selling it for. It's that plus 13 bucks for a decent fan, because this case, without a fan, it's no good. But if you add a fan, it does decently. So that's the good news. It's a bit on the high side for price. Raijintek's a smaller company. They make fewer products overall. They don't make as many at a time, so their costs are going to be higher than their competitors. So if you want like a smaller brand's product that's a very specific look and kind of competes in the Dancase category of looks, but not in price, Raijintek's trying to fill that market. They are very much targeting the Dancase style of Mini-ITX case, but at a significantly lower price. There are reasons the price is lower, of course, but if you're willing to make those sacrifices, it might be worth it to you. Still, for cooling purposes, we do favor the SG13. It's kind of a leader right now in a lot of ways. And the old Thermaltake Core V1 is another very good case that is a bit on the larger size. It's just in terms of volume, it's much bigger than most of the other cases, but it's still a small cube and does well for cooling. If you don't care about cooling, maybe you're going to use a small CLC or something if you can manage to cram one in here, or you're just okay with having a lot of fans and creating some noise as a result, then it's okay. This isn't our favorite case at all for ITX. There are a lot of things that can be done better. It does, so sometimes it feels like we're just going after the performance angle constantly, and although we are performance oriented, there are times when we can look at a case and appreciate that it's trying to do something else. Like maybe noise performance, still performance, but it's acoustics now, or maybe just build quality and looks, like some of the $1,000+ in-wind cases, for example. That H-Tower, that was never meant to be performance anything, it's just for looks. So we can appreciate that. This case though, it gets, even if you kind of watch our stuff and you go, man, these guys care way too much about thermal performance. The thing is with this case, it is actually genuinely a problem. And it is going to throttle clocks, and it is going to make it an issue for longevity of components. So it's okay, just add fans and check your temperatures and be a bit more cautious about it than you might be otherwise, and you can work with it. The case is, it just requires some more effort on your end to make it really work thermally and acoustically for everything that it wants to be. So that's the Raijintek Ophion. We are not 100% sure what the market is right now for this kind of case. There's absolutely a market for cases like this, but we're curious what kind of build you're putting in things like this. So if you are looking at building in a case about this size, let us know the parts you're picking, because it'll help us know for future testing what we should be looking at. So that's it for this one. Subscribe for more. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up some of our products like our shirts or mod mats to help us out directly, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly there as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.